A laundry truck route just walked into the FTC, and it might own half of America by next year. For decades, Cintas was the most forgettable stock on the NASDAQ. A white truck pulling up behind a restaurant at dawn. A driver swapping dirty uniforms for clean ones. A bill nobody in the C-suite ever read. And while nobody was watching, that boring laundry route turned into a $10 billion empire. Then in March 2026, Cintas tried to buy its biggest rival and walked straight into the first real antitrust fight in its history. $5.5 billion. That is what Cintas agreed to pay for UniFirst, the clear number 2 in North American uniform rental. $310 a share, half cash, half stock. The deal does not just add a competitor to the empire. It collapses a Big 3 industry into a Big 2 and forces the Federal Trade Commission to finally pay attention to a company it has ignored for a generation. Here is the quiet monopoly thesis, stated plainly. The best businesses on earth are not the loud ones. They are not the ones on the cover of magazines. They are toll booths. They sit between a customer and a boring, unavoidable weekly need, and they quietly collect rent, route by route, invoice by invoice, until the cost of dislodging them becomes mathematically impossible. CTAS is the textbook case. And for half a century it compounded so quietly that almost nobody noticed it had become a monopoly in waiting. 1 million businesses. That is the size of the captive customer base Cintas built across North America. Restaurants, hospitals, hotels, car dealerships, auto shops, factories. Every single one paying a small recurring invoice for clean uniforms, floor mats, soap dispensers, first aid kits, and fire extinguishers, all bundled into a single weekly service contract that almost never gets canceled. 1 million tiny tolls. Adding up to one very large empire. 12,100. That is how many local delivery routes Cintas operates out of 478 facilities, every working day in the United States and Canada. Each truck makes hundreds of stops on a tight suburban loop. The next stop on that loop costs almost nothing. The driver is already paid, the truck is already moving, the route is already optimized. That marginal cost approaching zero is not a footnote. It is the entire moat. This is what compounding looks like when nobody is watching. A new rival can rent a warehouse. They can buy a truck. They can hire a driver. What they cannot buy is decades of clustered customer density on the same suburban cul-de-sac. To match Cintas, you would have to build out an identical truck network, run it half empty for 10 years, and bleed money the entire time hoping customers eventually switch. Nobody is going to do that. That is the textbook definition of a structural moat. And the numbers prove it. Watch the climb, fiscal year by fiscal year. $7.1 billion in fiscal 2021, $7.85 billion the next year, then $8.82, then $9.6, then $10.34 billion in fiscal 2025. That is a 45% increase in 5 years, coming out of a generations-old laundry business that supposedly had nothing left to grow into, 22.8%. That is the operating margin Cintas hit in fiscal 2025, up from 21.6% the year before. 5 straight years of margin expansion. Read that again. Laundry is not supposed to be a 23% operating margin business. Software is a 23% margin business. Logistics is not. The only way you get there is if your route is so dense that every additional stop is almost pure profit. 95%. That is the share of Cintas revenue that arrives on autopilot. Recurring route-based service fees from uniform rental, first aid, and fire protection. Not one-time equipment sales, not project work. Subscriptions in steel-toed boots. The uniform rental and facility services segment alone is 76.9% of revenue. This is a software-style revenue model wearing a laundry uniform, and Wall Street took decades to figure that out. So that is the peak of the story. A $10 billion business, throwing off 23-cent operating margins on rented coveralls, with the recurring revenue profile of a software company and 1 million businesses locked into multi-service contracts. Cintas spent a generation proving the quiet monopoly thesis. The businesses that compound the hardest are the ones nobody bothers to talk about. And then, with the empire effectively complete, they made the move that broke the silence. Here is the industry, the day before the deal was announced. Cintas, sitting at roughly 35% of the North American uniform rental market. Vestas, the company Aramark spun out, at 14%, UniFirst at 13%, and a long tail of regional players holding the remaining 38%. A Big 3 structure with breathing room for everyone, 49%. That is the combined market share Cintas would control the day after closing the UniFirst deal. Call it half of every uniform rental dollar in North America. Vestas, with $2.8 billion in annual revenue, becomes a rounding error. The big three collapses into a duopoly. And the company that grew quietly for decades suddenly becomes the loudest competition story in industrial services. This is where the quiet monopoly stops being quiet. Cintas voluntarily extended the Federal Trade Commission's antitrust waiting period to give regulators more time to dig in. The expected close slipped from the first half of 2026 into the second half. The agency that ignored Cintas for decades is finally pulling out the route maps, the zip code overlap data, and the local market concentration tables. The most likely outcome is not a block. It is a forced divestiture of overlapping routes, city by city. $375 million. That is the annual cost synergy Cintas told shareholders it can extract from UniFirst's plants, routes, and back-office systems. It is a beautiful number for an investor presentation. It is also exactly the kind of number that tells an antitrust regulator, yes, these two networks overlap materially in the same cities, on the same streets. Synergies are just another word for overlap, and overlap is what the FTC actually measures. Here is the lesson, and it is the entire quiet monopoly thesis in one sentence. The toll booth model works precisely because it is boring. The moment a toll booth tries to buy the bridge next door, the public and the regulator finally see the bridge. Cintas will probably still close this deal. They will almost certainly give up local routes in dozens of metros to get it done. And the diluted earnings per share of $4.40 they delivered last year will keep compounding, just a little less freely than before. The dangerous monopolies are not the ones in the headlines. They are the ones in your parking lot at 6 a.m. Subscribe to Quiet Monopoly, and we will keep finding them before they make the news.